guys, tonight we begin with the dim glow of a flickering candle, a musty chamber pot tucked beneath the bed, and the soft rustle of lace cuffs being adjusted for the fifth time this hour. You see, in the golden gaslit age of Queen Victoria's empire, sleep was not so much a natural state of rest as it was a nightly confrontation with one's sole digestion conscience, and, if unlucky, the family goat who refused to stay in the stable. This wasn't a world of blackout curtains and lavender sprays. No, Victorian bedrooms were paradoxically over-furnished and under-insulated. Heavy drapes met drafty walls. Feather mattresses welcomed both dreams and the occasional beetle. And the candle, yes, the candle sat in its brass holder, always watching its flame, too feeble to illuminate, too stubborn to die out. Night after night it kept vigil beside the sleepless burning, not with comfort, but with judgment. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where and when you're tuning in from. I always enjoy knowing if you're listening from a noisy city at 2:17 a.m. or a quiet farmhouse just after the chickens have gone to bed. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It began, as many disasters do, with the best of intentions. The Victorians were a people deeply obsessed with self-control. One was to govern the body, the emotions, and even one's dreams, should they dare to be untidy. The body, in this view, was a leaky, mysterious engine, and sleep was both fuel and threat. Good citizens rose early, retired modestly, and never under any circumstances boasted about a full night's rest. That was either suspicious or French. To manage the dangers of nocturnal life, candles became the sleepless soul's most loyal companion. Not just for light, you see, but for reassurance. A flame, after all, was something warm, visible, and stubbornly alive, unlike poor Aunt Brambleton, who died 2 winters prior after confusing her cough syrup with the chambermaid's shoe polish. Candles multiplied like anxious rabbits. In many middle-class homes, it wasn't unusual to find 5 or 6 flickering in a single room, especially during the long night hours between 1 and 4 a.m. The heebie-jeebie hours, as the local apothecary once called them while rearranging his jars of pickled leeches. But these candles came at a cost. Not just beeswax or tallow, but sleep itself. Their smoky scent clung to bedclothes. Their flames played tricks on the eyeshadowy forms, shifting in the wardrobe the silhouette of a rocking chair that hadn't rocked in years, and occasionally a mysterious outline on the ceiling that looked suspiciously like the vicar. And of course, there were safety concerns. Entire pamphlets were devoted to proper candle placement to avoid setting one's bed curtains ablaze. The rules included: do not fall asleep with the candle on, which naturally insomniacs promptly ignored, and never place a lit candle on a pile of newspaper unless you are actively bored and also hate your house. Still, Victorians persisted. Some carried candle trays to bed like sacred offerings. Others used elaborate contraptions to snuff candles at a distant string's weights, and even trained pigeons, though the pigeon method fell out of favor after several feather-related incidents in Manchester. Historians still argue whether this obsession with candlelight helped or hindered sleep. Some claim it soothed the nerves. Others argue it delayed rest by hours, creating a kind of bedtime theater in which people performed sleeplessness for one another, adjusting their nightcaps, writing melancholy poetry, or composing strongly worded letters to their grocers. And then, of course, there was always that one neighbor who claimed to sleep like a baby. Despite the candlelight, despite the creaking pipes, despite the moonlight glaring straight into his second-story window, no one trusted him. His cheese was too sharp. Meanwhile, upstairs in a rented garret, a different sort of candle burned, a reading candle, shorter, fatter, scented faintly of lavender and ink. It accompanied the literary insomniacs, the ones who read Byron aloud to themselves in the hopes it might bore them to sleep, only to find themselves emotionally wrecked at 3 a.m. and scribbling sonnets with cold fingers. One young woman reportedly fell in love with her candle during such a vigil, named it Harold, wrote to it daily. The candle, for its part, never replied. This was the paradox of Victorian insomnia. The more effort one put into escaping it, the more it stuck. Candles were both remedy and trap. Their glow offered company, but also an excuse to remain alert, to keep thinking, keep stewing, keep watching the shadows for movement that deep down one hoped to never see. And so the flame flickered on long into the night. The goat stirred. The wind rattled the glass. The bard downstairs tuned his lute for no reason anyone could determine. And in the beds across Britain, thousands of tired souls stared at the ceiling, whispering softly, "Maybe tonight I'll finally sleep." They didn't. Now, if you'd asked a respectable Victorian physician why his patient hadn't slept in 3 nights, he'd likely lean back in his stiff-backed chair, steeple his fingers in the candlelight, and say something like, "Weak constitution, possibly brought on by novels, or a moral lapse, or miasmas, or a hat worn too tight." You see, in the elegant lunacy of 19th century England, sleep wasn't merely biological, it was a matter of character. A man who slept deeply was a man of clean conscience, proper digestion, and a habit of bathing only when socially pressured. And a woman who slept poorly, well, she'd clearly been reading French poetry again, or feeling too many emotions, or heaven forbid thinking after dusk. Victorian society turned sleep into a moral scoreboard, an insomnia. That was the red mark inked next to your name by the invisible headmaster of virtue. Mothers warned their daughters not to lie awake worrying, lest it affect their skin and reputation. Husbands fretted that their wives' restless tossing signaled guilt or worse opinions. Even the clergy got involved, offering sermons with titles like "On the Devil's Work Through Restless Minds." It didn't help that doctors, many of whom still wore mutton chops wide enough to affect their peripheral vision, approached sleeplessness with the bedside manner of a suspicious librarian. They prescribed tonics, poultices, and the occasional stern lecture. A popular remedy involved reciting psalms backward while standing barefoot in a cold hallway. Another suggested avoiding mental stimulation after sunset, which included chess embroidery and overlong glances at the moon. One particularly influential gentleman, Dr. Barnabas Fenwhistle, whose name now survives mostly in the form of a moth species and an aggressive cough syrup, claimed that insomnia stemmed from unbalanced humors and spiritual rebellion. His patients were instructed to place a damp linen cloth across their foreheads and think of England. If that failed, they were to picture a bowl of tepid porridge and imagine stirring it slowly for 20 minutes. Some claimed it worked. Most just grew hungry. And then came the books, pamphlets, manuals, treatises, entire anthologies dedicated to proper sleep etiquette, The Slumberer's Companion, Modest Repose, A Guide for the Respectable Sleeper, and Lest Ye Toss Nightly Reflections for the Morally Upright. They lined bedside tables like weary soldiers, promising rest while delivering elaborate routines that made preparing for bed feel like a minor opera. The advice varied wildly. Some experts insisted on 15 minutes of gentle prayer. Others recommended 147 toe stretches. Still others claimed that true sleep could only be earned by reflecting on one's behavior from sunrise to supper. If you fell short in charity patience or not kicking the chamber pot, sleep was postponed until repentance. Historians still argue whether Victorians truly believed insomnia was a sign of inner failure or whether they just needed something to blame between coughing fits and lukewarm gruel. Letters from the era reveal a quiet desperation beneath the starch. My mind was much disturbed last night, wrote one gentleman, due to excessive worry about the coal order and the troubling idea that I might have enjoyed a waltz too heartily. And who could blame them? They lived in a world lit by gas and guilt. Every yawn was a potential confession, every sleepy eye a sign of secret indulgence. The city itself was wired for worry, clock towers striking ominous hours, carriages clattering at ungodly times, and the general fear that somewhere someone might be resting improperly. As for children, they were warned that bad dreams came from sugar, impure thoughts, and looking at frogs too long. One guide suggested wrapping them tightly in damp flannel and singing in a minor key until they gave up and slept from despair, if not fatigue. Even pets weren't safe from scrutiny. A much shared anecdote tells of a cat in Bath who was exiled from the bedroom for appearing too satisfied with its own sleep. That cat, known only as Whiskers, took up residence in the pantry and developed a lifelong contempt for humans that echoed into the next century. There were, of course, exceptions. Artists, writers, and the occasional rogue philosopher claimed sleeplessness as a badge of genius. They wandered candlelit halls, muttering about the stars, scribbling in journals, with titles like Notes Toward a Perfect Night. Some insisted that true insight only came at 3:47 a.m., just as the street lamp flickered and the milkman coughed ominously in the alley below. But even they, for all their affectations, wanted sleep. The kind of sleep that wasn't tethered to virtue or repentance. Just rest, quiet, dreamless, non-judgmental rest. And so whether saint or sinner, poet or postman, nearly everyone eventually turned to something: tea, onions, heavy curtains, or sheer exhaustion. Because in a society where even your bed posture was considered a reflection of moral discipline, the simple act of falling asleep felt like an act of rebellion or grace. Lettuce. Let's talk about lettuce, that humble, crunchy harbinger of soggy sandwiches and sad buffet corners. In Victorian England, however, it was briefly revered not just as a vegetable but as a near sacred sedative, a green leafy answer to insomnia that came highly recommended by quacks, pamphleteers, and at least one duchess with a fondness for unusual teas. The theory was this lettuce, when boiled patiently and not too judgmentally, released a sleep-inducing essence. This essence, known to some as lettuce water and to others as mildly disappointing soup, was to be sipped slowly before bed, ideally while wearing a lace nightcap and thinking about absolutely nothing. It began, like many poor decisions, with a single, overconfident herbalist. One Dr. Winifred Plume, a man despite his name, once declared to the Society of Botanical Remedies that lettuce possessed a most calming tincture ideal for the frayed nerves of ladies and the dampened spirits of bookish clergymen. He had, in fairness, tested this only on a duck. The duck slept, though later investigation revealed it may have simply wandered off in boredom. Nevertheless, the claim spread. Soon housewives were boiling heads of Cos and romaine into cloudy brews, straining them into porcelain cups and handing them to family members with the hopeful optimism usually reserved for lottery tickets and ghost sightings. Some even added a pinch of nutmeg or a splash of gin, strictly for medicinal purposes, of course. Predictably, results were mixed. Some swore by it, claimed they hadn't slept so soundly since the Queen's last visit to Brighton. Others reported no effect whatsoever, except for an increase in nighttime trips to the chamber pot and an enduring distaste for salads. For one gentleman noted in his diary, "I am no more rested than before, but I do smell faintly of sandwich." Still, the cultural moment could not be denied. Lettuce became the vegetable of the sleepless. Grocers were besieged at dusk by pale-eyed citizens begging for the crispest head, as if the crunch correlated with potency. One London vendor capitalized on the craze by offering pre-boiled lettuce water in little corked bottles labeled Dr. Crispin's Nocturnal Elixir. Let the lettuce lead you. It sold out weekly, despite the fact it tasted like a pond that had once heard of seasoning. Historians still argue whether lettuce actually has a sedative effect. Some studies suggest a compound called lactucarium, sometimes called lettuce opium, might induce mild relaxation. Others argue the only real effect comes from the tedium of preparation, which exhausts the user into submission. Either way, the Victorians leaned in with admirable, if misplaced, enthusiasm. But of course, not everyone agreed. The medical establishment scoffed. Proper physicians declared lettuce water a peasant's brew fit for rabbits and fools. One editorial in the Lancet described it as slippery nonsense. Yet even as they dismissed it, many quietly sipped it behind closed doors, because when sleep remains, elusive dignity becomes negotiable. There were other variations too. Some believed raw lettuce consumed in dim candlelight worked better, especially if you mumbled a psalm and refused eye contact with your spouse. Others swore by chilled lettuce leaves wrapped around the feet. One woman claimed a leaf placed under the tongue would bring on dreams of the seaside and mild applause. A fringe movement known simply as the Order of the Fronds emerged in Bath. They met weekly to discuss leaf alignment, argue about lettuce species, and drink increasingly elaborate infusions with names like Nightshade's Nap and Green Composure. Their leader, a former beekeeper named Trevor, wore a crown of butter lettuce and claimed to have once slept for 11 hours straight under a tree. No one could verify it, but his complexion was undeniably radiant. Of course, all this lettuce enthusiasm also sparked commerce. Pillow makers offered lettuce-stuffed options. A short-lived perfumery experimented with evening romaine, a scent described by one reviewer as startlingly vegetal. And let's not forget the poor gardeners who found themselves suddenly wealthy and deeply resentful. Meanwhile, in less fashionable corners of England, the common folk observed all this with mild disbelief. "If lettuce could cure what ails you," muttered old Mrs. Trundle of Gorswick on the Thatch. My George would have been a poet by now. George, for his part, nodded in agreement and promptly fell asleep in a wheelbarrow. There was a quiet dignity in these homemade rituals, though, something tender in the image of a woman carefully boiling greens while the fire crackled low and the street outside settled into stillness. It was a kind of hope, not that the lettuce would solve anything, but that the effort itself might coax the body into rest. And perhaps that was the true appeal. Lettuce water, whale songs, or otherwise, none of these things guaranteed sleep. But they gave the insomniac something to do, a task, a potion, a reason to believe the night might eventually give in, if only gently. So the kettles boiled, the leaves wilted, the candlelight flickered across weary eyes, and another cup of warm, vaguely vegetal liquid was lifted to trembling lips, followed by the quiet prayer of every sleepless soul since time began. Please just this once. As the lettuce wilted and the candles sputtered, another enemy of the Victorian sleeper stirred from the shadow's noise. Now you may be thinking, surely the 19th century was quieter than today. And in some ways, yes, it lacked car alarms, dubstep, and the neighbor's overly enthusiastic leaf blower. But Victorian England had its own acoustic arsenal. Chimney sweeps rattling down flues at ungodly hours, coal carts clattering across cobblestones like caffeinated skeletons, roosters that neither respected the sun nor silence, and let's not even begin with the goat, that goat, always bleating at 2:13 a.m. like it had something urgent to say. Thus began the war on noise, a battle fought, not with weapons but with curtains, cork, and increasingly elaborate bedtime rituals. The wealthy took the first swing. These were people who believed firmly that silence was a matter of breeding, much like good teeth, or the correct pronunciation of bath. They invested in cork-lined bedrooms, a trend that, while effective at dampening sound, also made one's sleeping quarters resemble a wine cellar in mourning. Some households installed double-thick draperies layered like a cake made of velvet and ambition. The truly paranoid placed stuffed animals, real ones, unfortunately, in wall cavities to absorb vibrations. One particularly anxious gentleman reportedly had 37 badgers sewn into his bedroom walls. His house was famously quiet. It was also reportedly a bit pungent by spring. Middle-class solutions were no less creative. Bed hangings were drawn and pinned tightly shut, turning beds into miniature caves. Some pinned handwritten signs to their door, reading, "Quiet insomniac within." Others simply shouted, "Hush," at any noise louder than a whisper, including sneezes, dogs, and the wind. And let's not forget the unfortunate chimney sweepers, whose nocturnal soot adventures earned them an entire chapter in the Victorian Book of Bedtime Enemies. One pamphlet titled "Blackened Boys and Bedlam," a guide to rest, recommended tossing stale biscuits down the chimney as a deterrent. Not effective, but satisfying. Meanwhile, the cities only grew louder. London, with its endless hunger for progress, rang with the clatter of horses, the cries of newsboys, and the eternally mysterious shouts of rags and bones at midnight. No one knew quite what the rag and bone men were collecting at that hour, but they did it with impressive volume. Historians still argue whether the Victorian obsession with silence was a product of increasing urban stress or a moral crusade in disguise. Many believed that a quiet home was a moral one, that noise was not only disruptive but corrupting. The louder the street, the more likely it harbored sin-saucy novels or an unmarried aunt. Thus, silencing became something of a hobby. Inventors leapt to the challenge. Patents were filed for muffling carpets, whispering furniture, and snore-proof mattresses, though the last was mostly marketing. A gentleman in Yorkshire claimed to have designed a bed frame that emitted soothing sighs when one turned over. He was never heard from again. And then there were the anti-noise crusaders. People like Miss Temperance Higglebottom, who patrolled her street, nightly shushing window washers' cats, and once the moon. She wore a bonnet with the words, "Hush, please," embroidered in silver thread, and once tried to find a foghorn. Some even turned to music, but in its gentlest, most apologetic form. Soft parlor ballads, wind-up lullaby boxes, or in eccentric cases, recordings of nature sounds, a practice which we'll return to when the whales arrive. These sounds were carefully vetted for tranquility. The creak of a tree, acceptable. The hoot of an owl, borderline. A fox mating call, absolutely not. Of course, all this effort wasn't always rewarded. For every well-insulated sleeper, there were 10 who lay awake anyway, ears ringing with imagined noises or haunted by the echo of a dropped spoon 4 houses down. And for many, the silence itself became unbearable, too deep, too expectant, as if something awful was listening just beyond the edge of hearing. So began the cycle. Quiet the room, lie still, hear your heartbeat, doubt your decisions. Remember that time in 1847 when you called the vicar's wife, angular and spiral? Still the war raged on, curtains were thickened, rugs were tripled. One family in Bath even covered their floor with fresh moss for an entire season. It was soft, yes, but also moist. And by spring, they had an alarming number of brogs. One fringe group, known simply as the Mufflers, advocated for communal silence meeting weekly in a candlelit drawing room to not speak together. They claimed it built empathy, lowered anxiety, and improved dreams. It also proved helpful when trying to avoid talking to your in-laws, and all the while the goat continued to bleat. Eventually the movement plateaued. People began to suspect that no amount of muffling could stop the human brain from manufacturing noise of its own. Worries, regrets, to-do lists, and the occasional suspicion that the wallpaper was watching. But for a brief golden moment, silence had its reign. Cork and velvet subdued the world just enough. The candle flickered more softly. The goat, possibly bribed with turnip, fell quiet, and somewhere in a parlor just beyond the city, a woman in curlers finally exhaled and whispered at last. Not a sound, and then a cart hit a pothole and dumped 3 barrels of turnips outside her window. Now, when silence had failed and the lettuce had grown soggy from overuse, a few desperate Victorians turned their ears toward the sea. Not the actual sea, mind you, but an odd and increasingly popular idea of the sea. You see, in some corners of the British Empire, it was believed that whale songs, yes, whale songs held the power to lull even the most chronically fidgety gentleman into slumber. It all began, as these things often do, with a mildly eccentric baronet named Sir Almeric Swindlehurst, who claimed during a lecture at the Royal Society, or possibly just over dinner, that he had once fallen asleep during a sea voyage purely because a particularly musical whale hummed me to bed. Naturally, he had no proof. But he was tall, carried a cane shaped like a narwhal, and wore an expression of serene bewilderment that made people think he probably knew things. Within weeks, the phrase whale resonance therapy began appearing in pamphlets, though often printed with varying levels of spelling and confidence. Now, to be clear, most Victorians had never actually heard a whale sing. The available recordings, such as they were, came from curious sailors who described the sounds as mournful foghorns having a polite disagreement underwater. But in a time when people believed in mesmerism, magnetic sleep hats, and cures involving beetroot juice soaked in moonlight whale songs, didn't seem entirely unreasonable. Enter the parlor cetationists. This short-lived but flamboyantly devoted group believed that simulated whale calls, when properly replicated through means like bassoons, wet cello strings, and one memorable incident involving a man humming into a teacup, could induce deep and meaningful rest. They gathered on Wednesday evenings to conduct sleep concerts, in which attendees reclined on fainting couches while a volunteer ensemble attempted to reproduce what they imagined whales sounded like. By all reports, it was terrible. One guest described the event as a collision between a funeral dirge and a moose with bronchitis. Another claimed to have fallen asleep only because he fainted from laughter. Still they persisted. By the third meeting, attendance had doubled. By the fifth, the musical score had expanded to include water-filled glass jars, a tuned umbrella, and a man known only as Fergus, who specialized in subaqueous grumbling. Not to be outdone, an enterprising widow from Kent created a line of marine dream pillows stuffed with dried seaweed and perfumed with saltwater essence. She marketed them as infused with the dreams of leviathans. Customers reported everything from improved sleep to disturbing dreams of kelp entanglements. One gentleman claimed his pillow whispered maritime gossip, but later admitted he may have simply overindulged in oysters. Historians still argue whether any of these methods produced real results. Some posit that the sound frequencies of actual whale song, if available at all, might have relaxed the nervous system. Others argue that it wasn't the sound that mattered, but the idea of surrendering to something enormous, slow and serenely disinterested in human anxieties. After all, what better model for peace than a creature that naps mid-swim and considers krill an exciting snack? Even the more skeptical minds of the day found some poetic charm in it. The notion that the ocean vast, ancient, and stubbornly indifferent might sing one to sleep had a strangely comforting ring. It echoed through poems, paintings, and the occasional candle label, whale rest, notes of brine and hope. Of course, not everyone was on board. Clergymen found it suspicious. The whale is not your shepherd, warned one sermon. It doth not lead thee beside still waters, but into them. A stern magistrate banned all simulated whale concerts in his district after receiving a formal complaint that the sounds had agitated local ducks. And then there were the imitators. Soon, charlatans began offering whale harmoniums wooden boxes that allegedly emitted soothing cetacean melodies when cranked. In truth, they mostly groaned like disappointed furniture. Still they sold. The promise of rest is a potent thing, especially to a man who's been awake since Monday. By the turn of the decade, whale song had drifted into the broader category of aquatic therapies, sharing a shelf with sea baths, kelp poultices, and the infamous practice of submerging one's feet in ice water while listening to the recitation of ship logs. That last one never caught on. Meanwhile, in quieter corners of the countryside, insomniacs, without access to musical whales, made do. They stood by lakes and whispered to ducks. They hummed into seashells. One man read Moby Dick aloud each night, hoping to absorb whale energy through proximity. He never slept, but he did become remarkably literate in harpoon terminology. And so the whale sang on, or rather the idea of it did, in parlors and bedrooms, in dreams, and in desperate hope. It wasn't science, nor even effective art, but it was, in its way, deeply human. A sleepy stab at finding peace in the song of something far away, impossibly large and drifting through the dark with neither guilt nor candles. The goat notably remained unimpressed. Of all the remedies the Victorians earnestly applied to their sleepless plight, few were quite so onion-scented or sock-centric as what would come to be known without irony as the midnight onion sock affair. Now, in theory, the idea wasn't entirely mad. Onions were believed to draw out bad humors, warm the blood, and gently coax restless spirits back into slumber. How they were supposed to do this from inside one's footwear remains a mystery that even the Royal College of Physicians politely refused to explore. The method was simple. At night, preferably just before bed, and absolutely after brushing one's teeth with soot paste and quiet regret, one sliced a raw onion into half moons. These pungent crescents were then lovingly placed against the soles of the feet, like oddly aggressive foot angels, and secured with one's woolen night socks, preferably thick, preferably itchy. From there, one simply lay back and waited. Some claimed the smell alone was soporific. Others insisted it was the warming effect of the onion's spiritual oils. A particularly hopeful pamphlet titled The Root of Rest suggested that the sulfuric compounds would chase away demons of anxiety and encourage dreams of meadows lambs and firm moral structure. More skeptical observers, however, noted that the only guaranteed outcome of the practice was waking up with socks that now doubled as weapons of nasal destruction. Still, it caught on. There were entire households where every bedroom reeked faintly of soup. Children were sent to bed with weeping feet. Husbands grumbled in the dark, trying not to inhale. Wives proudly announced they'd had a solid 4 hours before the onion slid out and considered it a triumph. A widow in Lincolnshire became locally famous for offering customized onion placements. "You want dreams of waterfalls?" she'd ask, pressing a red onion slice to the arch. "You want to forget your taxes? Yellow onion left foot only." Her clientele included 2 aldermen, a bishop's niece, and the town goat who was briefly employed as a foot warmer. Of course, not everyone was delighted. The mice were first to revolt. Many a quiet Victorian night was interrupted by the tiny rage-filled squeaks of rodents who had wandered into a sock drawer and been overcome by the allium fumes. One such mouse, known as Tobias in family lore, abandoned his nest entirely and took up residence in the flour tin, where he lived in peace until the Great Muffin Collapse of 1882. Historians still argue whether the onion sock method ever actually helped anyone sleep. Some believe the ritual itself, the peeling, slicing, wrapping, offered a comforting sense of control. Others argue it was just another way to feel like you were doing something while your brain, like a spoiled Victorian child, threw its nightly tantrum. But there were a few unexpected reports of success. One woman claimed she dreamt of her late husband for 3 nights, straight after applying leeks to her heels. A man in Devon wrote a letter to the gentleman's napper, stating that he slept peacefully with an onion on each foot and one under his pillow, though he admitted the dreams involved an uncomfortable number of soup-related metaphors. Of course, society being what it was, the onion sock trend didn't stay confined to the home. It began creeping into polite conversation. At teas and luncheons, one might overhear, "Oh, you simply must try the Wensleydale Red on your instep. My nerves haven't jangled since." Or "I hear Lady Tuffleby's butler sleeps on nothing but a bed of scallions now." Divine. This led to an unfortunate class divide in onion sleep remedies. The upper crust, always eager to distinguish themselves, began importing exotic alliums, shallots from France, sweet onions from the colonies. Even pickled onions were tried, though one gentleman was hospitalized after confusing them with his monocle. Then came the nightwear accessories, onion holsters, sock inserts lined with absorbent cabbage. One truly regrettable product called the toe sleeve infusomatic, which steamed onions into the sock via a foot-operated bellows. It was briefly popular then, quickly banned after 2 cases of blistered arches and a small fire. And yet, for all the silliness, the onion sock affair was strangely endearing. It revealed something soft beneath the starch and the lace, a shared desperation for rest, yes, but also a kind of collective whimsy, a belief that even the humble onion, if treated with enough ceremony, might coax sleep from behind the bedroom curtains. At the end of the day, Or rather, deep into the night, the onion was just one more unlikely ally in the great Victorian campaign for slumber. It joined the lettuce the whale songs and the ever-present goat in a sleepy parade of well-meaning absurdities. And somewhere in a modest cottage, a grandmother pulled on her socks, patted the onion slices flat, and whispered to the night, "Let's give this another go, shall we?" Now, if onions in your socks didn't do the trick, and let's be honest, they mostly didn't, then the next logical step was, of course, to drink something brown and mysterious out of a bottle labeled soothing tonic, and trust that the man who sold it to you wasn't legally required to list the ingredients. Thus began the golden age of the Victorian sleep tonic, a swirling concoction of hope habit and hazardous substances, best described as almost entirely made of lies. To be fair, not all tonics were malicious. Some were merely delusional. A popular blend sold as Dr. Minberry's elixir for nightly repose was a syrupy mix of molasses-diluted brandy and something vaguely herbal that may have been parsley or a mistake. The label claimed it calmed the blood, soothed the spleen, and discouraged dreams of wolves. It sold spectacularly. Most tonics, though, were part medicine, part marketing, and part roulette. Laudanum, the most infamous of the bunch, was a potent mix of alcohol and opium administered in dainty teaspoons to both adults and children alike. A safe and gentle aid to rest the label said, though, the effects ranged from dreamless sleep to mild addiction to waking up in the neighbor's hedge without trousers. And yet people kept sipping. Why? Because tonic bottles whispered a promise: drink me and you'll sleep. Drink me and your worries will soften. Drink me and maybe, just maybe, you'll stop picturing the goat's accusing stare at midnight. The advertising helped, of course. Tonic makers were masters of the grand claim: restorative to the bones and brain, a balm for widows, scholars, and pale children. Sleep in 60 seconds or your money back if you can still count. Some even leaned into mystery. One small-town apothecary sold a tincture called Nightfall's Secret, wrapped in black paper and sealed with purple wax. No one knew what was in it. Some suspected plum wine. Others whispered foxglove. One woman claimed it made her speak fluent French in her dreams. Another said it turned her curtains slightly blue. Most people just used it for Tuesdays. Historians still argue whether tonics worked. The debate usually divides into three camps: those who say the sedatives helped, those who say the alcohol knocked people unconscious, and those who believe people just felt too guilty to admit it wasn't working and kept drinking out of politeness. Then there were the homebrew tonics devised by ambitious grannies, traveling herbalists, and the occasional bored beekeeper. These often included such ingredients as poppy syrup, crushed nutmeg, essence of turnip, gooseberry wine, spirits of soot, which was exactly what it sounds like, and in one alarming case, pulverized seashells to anchor the soul. The results varied. Some induced sleep, others induced vomiting. A few induced spontaneous poetry, which was met with mixed reviews by housemates. Of course, tonic culture wasn't just about consumption, it was also about display. A well-appointed Victorian bedroom boasted at least 2 bottles of vaguely medicinal liquid on the nightstand, ideally with labels in copperplate script and corks that refused to open properly. To own no tonics was to appear unprepared. To own too many was to admit weakness. The trick was to appear casually restful, as though sleep were simply a matter of tasteful beverages and good posture. There was even a moment, brief but memorable, when tonic tasting parties became a fashionable affair. Guests would gather at dusk, dressed in embroidered robes, and sip from an array of sleep potions served in tiny silver spoons. They compared notes, judged aromas, and occasionally passed out during the third round. One hostess in Bristol reportedly held a competition to see who could stay conscious longest after a dose of Midnight's Murmur. The winner blinked once and then slumped dramatically into the punch bowl. Naturally, the market became crowded. For every semi-reputable tonic maker, there were 5 dubious entrepreneurs selling bottles filled with pond water, stale vinegar, or pure northern fog. Labels became increasingly desperate. Endorsed by Her Majesty's third cousin, or tested on a swan, the swan was unavailable for comment. By the 1880s, the tonic craze began to wane. Not because people stopped believing, but because too many of them started waking up with questions. Why does my hair taste like cloves? Did I write a love letter to my postman? Is it normal to dream exclusively in Latin? These, while intriguing, were not widely considered symptoms of restful sleep. Even the goat, ever the silent observer, once nosed an open bottle left on the windowsill, and then spent the entire night attempting to climb a ladder. The ladder was in someone else's garden. No one knows why. And yet, for all their faults, tonics weren't entirely useless. Sometimes the ritual mattered more than the remedy. The shaking of the bottle, the glug into a chipped teacup, the slow sip as the fire cracked and the curtains breathed with the wind. It wasn't just what you drank, it was the moment you allowed yourself to believe sleep might come. Because the real truth, the soft underbelly of all these absurd efforts was this: people just wanted peace, a little quiet, a little surrender, and if they had to drink something that tasted like anise and chimney soot to get there, well, so be it. After all, a sleepy lie is still better than a wide-awake truth. Now, not all solutions came bottled or steeped or sliced into moon-shaped onion slippers. Some Victorians, fed up with remedies that left them smelling like a garden salad or whispering to whale impersonators, did something unexpected. They gathered, they formed a club, and they called it, without the slightest trace of irony, the Society of Gentle Sleepers. Founded in a modest drawing room on Fog Button Lane, London, sometime around 1874, exact records are lost, possibly under a pillow. This peculiar society was dedicated to one goal: curing sleeplessness through conversation about not sleeping. Yes, they met weekly, well past bedtime, to drink warm milk, discuss the art of dozing, and argue gently about the best position in which to wait for sleep to arrive. They were not insomniacs, they insisted. They were patients of night's hesitation. Membership was invitation only. One had to demonstrate a sincere inability to fall asleep before midnight, a fondness for velvet robes, and a willingness to speak in hushed tones, even when angry. Meetings were held by candlelight, with all clocks covered, lest time itself begin to feel aggressive. Each gathering began with the ceremonial lighting of the drowsing lamp, an old oil lamp said to have belonged to a Napoleonic general who once fell asleep during a siege. There is no evidence to support this, but the lamp did smell faintly of gunpowder and lavender. The members, mostly middle-class professionals and the occasional retired sea captain, brought diaries filled with their sleep experiments. One man had tried placing breadcrumbs in his shoes to confuse the body into rest. A woman confessed to having stared at a doorknob for 4 hours straight, claiming it was hypnotically indifferent. One fellow, a Mr. Tibble, became the society's unofficial record keeper. He kept track of all attempted remedies in a notebook titled Chronicles of the Drowsy Yet Determined, which included such techniques as whispering lullabies to oneself in Morse code, inhaling the steam of boiled celery, lying face down on a copy of the Times while humming the national anthem backwards, mentally folding socks for imagined orphans, and yet for all their experiments, none of them really slept. Not soundly, not often. But that wasn't the point. The gentle sleepers believed that the pursuit of sleep was itself noble, that there was something dignified in the attempt. They were not a club for curing, but for witnessing one another's wakefulness. Historians still argue whether the group was more therapeutic or performative. Was it a sleep support group or a polite way to socialize without admitting loneliness? One letter found in an attic decades later reads, "I do not think I sleep more since joining, but now I am less alone while not doing it." Their rituals were charmingly specific. Members would recline on fainting couches or lay curled in floor blankets called dream rugs. One chapter held their meetings inside a room lined with ticking clocks so they might face the enemy with gentle courage. Another outlawed yawning, declaring it a false prophet of sleep. Refreshments were light and unspiced. Warmed oat milk, steamed apples. Once someone brought chocolate and was quietly asked never to return. They followed a rotating schedule of discussion topics such as, on the breaths between tossings, is sleep a guest or a thief? The ethics of napping before you've earned it. Do pillows remember us? Occasionally, a member would nod off mid-meeting. This was considered a triumph. Everyone would fall still, hands over hearts, and whisper congratulations into the candlelight. The dozer was gently covered with a dream rug and left to drift, while others continued murmuring about mattress firmness and the dangers of late evening biscuits. Of course, the society was not without its critics. Neighbors complained of strange nighttime gatherings, worried it was a cult of some kind. One article in the Evening Post described them as a band of professionally tired lunatics who treat sleeping as if it were chess. But the members remained undeterred. They believed in the cause, or at least they believed in not being laughed at alone in the dark. The gentle sleepers soon inspired offshoot groups, the Midnight Watch, the Pillow Inquiry, and one particularly dramatic circle known as the League of Drowsy Sovereignty, who wore silk sashes and addressed each other as your sleepfulness. And yes, they all kept minutes. Even the goat was at one point inducted as an honorary member after wandering into a meeting and falling asleep on the secretary's feet. No one had the heart to remove him, and for 3 weeks he became the club mascot, snoring contentedly through recitations of poetic monologues about rest. Eventually, as trends do, the society faded. Members passed on, others finally and suspiciously began to sleep. The drowsing lamp was extinguished for the last time sometime around 1892, though there are unconfirmed reports of it flickering again in a pub cellar in 1921. And yet the spirit of the society endures, not in tonics or tricks, but in that quiet, stubborn hope that someone else is also awake and willing to talk about it, softly, with warm milk and unspoken understanding. Because sometimes what helps isn't sleep itself, but knowing you aren't the only one chasing it. Of course, when conversation failed and onions had lost their pungent charm and your tonic bottle was now just a fancy paperweight that smelled faintly of regret, there remained one final sport for the truly seasoned Victorian insomniac clock watching. Now, this was not merely glancing at the hour. No. Clock watching done properly was a full contact, deeply meditative nightly endeavor. One that required emotional stamina, a decent view of the mantelpiece, and a relationship with time that can only be described as complicated. It would begin innocently enough. A glance, just to check. Perhaps it's later than it feels. Perhaps the night has passed you without notice like a polite ghost. It's 12:08 a.m. You close your eyes, think soft thoughts. Count sheep with tiny monocles. Count sheep filing taxes. You open your eyes. 12:11 a.m., and now the game begins. Victorians didn't just check the time, they tracked it. They watched it creep stall, occasionally reverse if you stared hard enough, and had consumed enough valerian. Some kept journals beside the bed, recording each sighting like stargazers chasing comets. 2:14 a.m., sound of wind. 2:27 a.m., heard Mr. Biswell's sneeze 3 doors down. 2:39 a.m., curtain moved. Possible specter or draft. And yet for all its exasperations, clock watching came with its own rhythms. The house would quiet. The city would settle into its deep mechanical breathing, pumps, pipes, the occasional distant bark. And there, in the flicker of candlelight, or the dull glow of a smoldering hearth time, would become something else, a companion, an adversary, a mirror. Most homes had more than one clock. The parlor mantel clock, the upstairs hallway regulator, the mysterious one in the kitchen that chimed only when someone was grieving or slightly tipsy. A true insomniac could tell you which one was fast, which was honest, and which was vindictive. Some preferred the ticking, found it comforting like the heartbeat of a well-meaning but emotionally distant relative. Others found it maddening, like being slowly measured out in teaspoons. One poet, Miss Tilda Fairweather, wrote, "The tick is the nail on which my sleep is hung too high to reach, too loud to ignore." She later attempted to replace her clock with a sundial, indoors. Clock watching gave rise to an entire subculture of late-night hobbies, estimating how long a candle would take to reach the brass lip, calculating how many floorboard creaks led to the chamber pot, predicting the exact moment the coal would collapse in on itself with a sound like a judgment. Historians still argue whether this nightly tracking was soothing or masochistic. One camp insists that the act of watching time gave Victorians a sense of control in a world where they had very little. Another claims it fed anxiety like coal to a fire. A third group has notably fallen asleep mid-argument. There were even accessories. Time-soothing covers for the more aggressive tickers. Waking watches that promised to distract the eye with beautifully scripted numbers and dainty ivory hands. One gentleman commissioned a clock that slowly dimmed as the hour progressed, so that by 3:00 a.m. it was entirely dark and one had no choice but to surrender. The clock was beautiful. It was also deeply impractical, as it failed to alert him when it was time to collect his mother from the train station. And then there were the no clocks. At all enthusiasts, a rebellious bunch who believed that removing all references to time would invite the natural drowsiness of the body. These brave souls were often found crawling around the bedroom floor at 4 a.m., wondering aloud if the sun had risen or if that was just the wallpaper glowing again. But perhaps the most advanced practitioners of the art were those who could tell the time by sound alone. The distant clunk of the bakery cart, the soft chime from the inn's front door, the unmistakable snort of the neighborhood goat who only grunted at 3:42 a.m. every single night without fail. No one knew why. The goat had his secrets. There's something quietly noble about it all. The steadfast gaze at the hour hand. The ritual of knowing. Even when sleep doesn't come, one can still bear witness to the passage of time. One can say, I was there at 1:27. I heard the owl. I felt the fire breathe its last. And maybe if you watched long enough, if you waited just right, you'd catch sleep, sneaking in from the corner of your eye. slipping between the seconds, settling over you like a soft, slightly judgmental quilt. Because if nothing else, clock watching taught patience. Taught. And in an age of bustle and stiff collars and unsmiling portraits, patience was as close to peace as most ever got. The goat, for what it's worth, approved. But he never said so out loud. Now no bedtime tale would be complete without mention of the bard who sang to pillows. Yes, pillows. Not people, not babies, not lovers adrift in moonlight, but pillows. And occasionally bolsters if they were well behaved. This peculiar tradition sprouted in the drawing rooms and boudoirs of Britain's more eccentrically wealthy households, where it was believed that music, when properly directed, could be absorbed by inanimate objects. And so certain households took it upon themselves to commission lullabies specifically for their bedding. It started as many things did with one overly inspired household, Lady Prunella Wigginton of Sussex, a woman whose fondness for velvet knew no earthly limits, hired a young bard named Lysander, yes, just Lysander, to sing nightly into her feather pillows. Her reasoning feathers, having once known the wind, respond to melody. No one knew quite what that meant, but Lysander was paid 3 shillings an evening and given a silver brooch shaped like a flute, so he complied. Each night, as the house dimmed and the stew cooled and the goat began his usual bedtime monologue, Lysander would step into the master bedroom, bow gravely to the pillows, and begin. He sang softly, ballads, sea shanties, the occasional hymn rearranged into a slow waltz, all directed toward the bedding with a sincerity that bordered on devotional. The servants were instructed not to speak of it, but several could be found snickering in the hallway, mouthing the words to "O Pillow Mine" with theatrical solemnity. The idea, however strange, caught on. Soon other households followed suit. Some hired violinists, others brought in harpists who plucked lullabies while seated in wicker chairs facing the mattress. One bold family arranged for an oboe quartet to serenade the linens every full moon. The oboes were said to confuse the goose down, inducing a state of ambient surrender. Historians still argue over where the belief began. One theory suggests it came from Eastern folk tales in which objects retain emotion. Another points to a misreading of a French article on dream incubation. A third insists the whole thing was the result of one too many glasses of elderberry wine and a rainy afternoon without distractions. Regardless of its origin, the custom developed its own etiquette. Music was to be performed before the pillows were laid out, never during. No sharp notes were allowed, especially not F, which was considered a waking tone. Lyrics had to be benevolent. No battle ballads, no tragedy. Certainly no songs involving shipwrecks, unless the shipwreck ended in gentle romance and uninterrupted sleep. And the pillows? Oh, they had favorites. Some swelled noticeably under the strains of a minor lullaby. Others fluffed themselves during waltzes. One particularly haughty pillow was rumored to sulk unless addressed directly by name. Lord Snoozington, if you must know. Lysander claimed he could sense when a pillow was displeased, usually by the way it resisted the downbeat or rustled disapprovingly. Word spread. A minor industry grew around bed music. Pamphlets emerged. Harmony for the headrest. The musical mattress. Unlocking the dreams within. Feathers and fugues. A composer's guide to down-filled devotion. Soon furniture shops offered pre-sung pillows, each reportedly treated to a performance of Brahms or Mendelssohn before shipping. The effect was according to the label infused. Some even came with a certificate of serenade. Of course, not all were convinced. Practical types scoffed. "It's a pillow," they said, "not a concert goer." But when pressed, many admitted to sleeping slightly better on a cushion that had once heard Chopin, or at the very least, Greensleeves. There was for a time even a pillow music registry in London where homeowners could log their household's preferred tunes. It included helpful notes like, "The guest bed likes lullabies in a minor. The nursery responds well to humming. Avoid Rule Britannia unless prepared for dreams of marching." And yes, naturally someone tried to market musical pillowcases. One ambitious tailor embedded tiny music boxes into the seams. Unfortunately, they often wound down mid-slumber producing sounds, not unlike a dying squirrel. Lawsuits followed. Still in the quiet dark of Victorian bedrooms, as the fire dwindled and the draft crept up through the floorboards, many found comfort in this strange little ritual. There was something sweetly absurd and oddly tender about the notion that the very object upon which one laid one's weary head might carry a tune in its fluff. Perhaps it wasn't about the pillow at all. Perhaps it was just easier to imagine that if someone sang softly into the thing that held your worries, your memories, your muttered dreams, then maybe, just maybe, those dreams would be gentler, and the night, for once, would pass without incident. Besides, even if the pillow didn't sleep better, the people certainly hoped it would. And in the great candlelit comedy of Victorian self-care, sometimes hope was the strongest lullaby of all. The goat, as usual, preferred silence. Now, should your pillows prove unmusical, your clocks too judgmental, and your onions overly enthusiastic, the next frontier for the sleepless Victorian was water-hot, steamy, slightly suspicious. Water preferably filled with something leafy, barky, or faintly moss-scented. We speak now of the bath, but not just any bath. The scalding, hot, birch-leaf-infused, soul-softening sleep bath, often followed by regret and the quiet suspicion that one may have overcooked one's knees. To understand the Victorian sleep bath, one must first understand the bathtub itself, an object that, depending on your social class, was either a luxurious porcelain vessel tucked behind a velvet screen, or a large tin pail dragged into the kitchen once a week and filled from a kettle that sighed like an elderly maid. Most working-class families shared a single tub. Baths were staggered by age rank and general filth level. It was not uncommon for a child to exclaim, "Oh, bother, there's an ear in the water," only to be told, "Don't be silly, that's a raisin from grandfather's snacking." Grandfather, of course, had bathed first, always. But for those lucky enough to bathe alone and without raisins, the ritual of the sleep bath became a kind of sacred prelude to slumber. The theory went like this: submerge your body in water so hot it questioned your choices. Fill it with leaves from trees that had never been formally interviewed for the job, and sit perfectly still until either your skin pruned or your worries surrendered. The leaves were crucial. Birch was especially fashionable, imported from Sweden, chopped with grave ceremony, and sold in bundles wrapped in brown paper with names like Restful Frond or Dream Twig. Other contenders included elderflower, marjoram, lavender, and in one ill-advised moment, nettles, which proved more invigorating than intended. One popular remedy came from a pamphlet titled The Sleepy Soaker's Companion, which recommended this brew: 3 handfuls of birch leaves, a quarter cup of oat husk, 1 whisper of rosemary to be spoken, not measured, and a boiled apple for emotional balance. The bather was instructed to soak while thinking of absolutely nothing. This proved difficult. Most reported thinking instead of taxes, suspicious moles, their cousin's engagement to that man who smelled like damp straw, and the goat who could be heard trotting across the roof again. Of course, not all baths were private affairs. Some wealthier households employed bath attendants, usually stern women named things like Miss Grumble or Mrs. Wick, who adjusted water temperature with a level of precision previously reserved for military maneuvers. "You'll sleep like a saint," they'd mutter, pouring in another ladle of boiling birch broth. "Or your knees will. The rest of you may dream of fire." In certain towns, public bathhouses embraced the sleep craze by offering somnolent soakings after sundown. These sessions involved dim candlelight string quartets behind screens and attendants who spritzed rose water in time with the music. It was all very tranquil until someone slipped on a discarded chamomile sachet and ruined the ambiance with a spectacular splash. Historians still argue over the true effects of these baths. One camp insists that the heat relaxed tight muscles and soothed restless minds. Another argues that the ritual mattered more than the temperature, that preparing the bath, selecting the herbs, waiting for the kettle to boil, all gave a sense of control in a world where rest was increasingly elusive. Then there's the third camp, which claims the entire movement was funded by the bath towel lobby, whose influence remains woefully underexplored. Side effects were common. Some bathers reported excessive drowsiness followed by full-on floor naps. Others emerged pink, perplexed, and vaguely herbal, insisting they could now smell dreams. One gentleman fell asleep in the tub and awoke 4 hours later to find the bathwater tepid and his toes whistling. There were even a few fringe variations. Cold water advocates, or the splashers as they were known, insisted that shocking the system would reset the sleep clock. Their motto was, "Freeze the mind, rest the soul." Their meetings were short and involved a great deal of shivering. And then there were the floating experiments. Some daring souls attempted to recreate the feeling of weightlessness, believing it would lull them into a prenatal state of rest. They packed their tubs with extra salt, tied small pillows to their necks, and attempted to drift like sea otters. Most just ended up with waterlogged ears and an impressive ability to describe ceiling cracks in detail. One woman in Dorset claimed to have achieved perfect sleep alignment by balancing a teacup on her stomach while floating. When asked what happened if the cup tipped, she replied, "Then it simply wasn't the night." Even the goat, perhaps envious, was once discovered attempting to bathe in the wash tub. He emerged scented like marjoram and utterly unrepentant. In the end, the bath was never just about cleanliness or even sleep. It was about permission. Permission to pause, to prepare, to steep yourself, quite literally in the hope that the world might soften, that your heart might stop racing, that your bones might remember stillness. And maybe, just maybe, when you climbed into bed, smelling faintly of birch and boiled apples, your dreams would arrive a little more gently, with fewer arguments, fewer clocks, fewer goats. Now we come to a subject both divisive and fur-covered, the Victorian debate over cats and sleep hygiene. Yes, cats. You see, while modern sleepers may curl up beside their purring companions with vague notions of comfort and shared existential dread, Victorian society was sharply split. Some swore cats were calming. Others believed they were demonic conduits of insomnia. And a few insisted they were merely decorative cushions with whiskers and murderous intent. The medical literature, if one dares to call it that, wasn't much help. One 1867 article in the British Slumber Journal argued cats may emit a soporific aura when curled clockwise, but counterclockwise motion produces fretful dreams and digestive regret. The author was later discovered to have owned no cats, but several taxidermied squirrels. Meanwhile, folk wisdom was even more unhelpful. It was commonly believed that cats stole your breath if you left your mouth open while sleeping. There were earnest debates about whether this was out of malice or simple feline curiosity. One woman in Lancashire swore her cat removed her snoring entirely. It was later discovered she just developed laryngitis. Despite all this, cats were everywhere, especially in bedrooms. Why? Because they refused to be not in bedrooms. You could lock a door and they would find the window. You could bar the window and they'd tunnel through the coal chute. One clever tabby named Spriggan was known to appear inside a linen chest, regardless of whether the lid was open or closed. Thus, the insomniacs adapted. Some embraced the feline presence, fully declaring that purring was nature's lullaby in fur. They encouraged cats to sleep on their bellies, their feet, their foreheads, wherever the little beast saw fit. One man claimed his cat's whiskers aligned with the moon and guided his dreams. Another simply said, "She sits on my head. I don't ask questions anymore." Others took a more adversarial stance. A lady from Cheltenham developed an elaborate system of cat deterrence involving orange peels, sandalwood shavings, and an old French horn. It worked for a week until the cat made peace with the horn and began using it as a bed. And then there were the neutral tolerators, those too tired to care. They accepted the cat as one accepts gravity. Annoying, inevitable, occasionally helpful when locating dropped objects. These folks often woke to find their felines perched on their chests' tails, flicking like metronomes of mild disdain. Historians still argue whether cats helped or hindered Victorian sleep. One school points to the rhythmic purring and warmth as deeply soothing. Another suggests that the nocturnal tendencies of cats, scratching, sprinting, staring at corners as if a ghost had just said something rude, were deeply disruptive. There's also the matter of dream interference. It was believed by some that cats could insert themselves into your dreams if you slept too close to them. This theory was popular among spiritualists and those who'd recently had unsettling visions of mice wearing waistcoats. One pamphlet even suggested that cats carried astral baggage from their previous lives as Egyptian priests or French aristocrats. Naturally, this sparked a brief trend in cat dreaming experiments. Participants recorded their dreams nightly, noting any feline involvement. Results varied wildly. One woman dreamed of floating through a soup made entirely of meows. A man from Kent reported 3 consecutive dreams of his cat lecturing him about taxes. Several participants simply woke with cat hair in their mouths and gave up. The pillow companies were not amused. Some began marketing cat-resistant cases with buttons, clasps, and allegedly unappealing fabric textures. The cats were entirely unbothered. One cat was observed unbuttoning the pillow with a single claw and a look that said, "Nice try." Of course, not all interactions were so subtle. There's a famous account of Lord Happelstone, who once attempted to remove his cat, Bishop Meow, from the bed during a sleepless night. The resulting scratch required 7 stitches and ended Lord Happelstone's fencing career. And yet, despite everything, despite the twitching tails, the sudden yowls, the unexpected 3 a.m. acrobatics people kept letting the cats stay. Because sometimes, even in a world of noise tonics, judgmental clocks and boiled lettuce, a warm little creature curled by your ribs was the one thing that made the night bearable. It didn't matter if they caused a sneeze or flattened your dreams. In a dark room filled with worries and wool, That small purring body was a quiet reminder that not everything needs a reason to stay. They stayed because they could, because they wanted to, because they knew you were awake. And in their indifferent affection, there was something almost restful. Almost. The goat, for his part, maintained a strict no cats policy and once chased 3 out of the pantry with what can only be described as theatrical snorting. And so we reach the moon, not metaphorically, not romantically. No swooning lovers or wistful sighs here, just a cold, pale orb hanging in the night sky, blamed for everything from madness to mildew. In Victorian England, the full moon was often regarded not as a celestial wonder, but as a direct assault on one's ability to get a decent night's sleep. One pamphlet from 1872 titled Lunacy, the sky's uninvited guest, claimed that sleeping beneath moonlight could trouble the blood-invite sinful reveries and result in night cravings for pickled eggs. Another slightly more scientific publication suggested the moon's reflected sunlight agitated the nervous system and made the curtains flutter at unsettling times. In truth, many Victorians simply didn't trust the moon. It was too watchful, too quiet, too present. And so moon avoidance became something of a national pastime. The first and most obvious tactic: curtains. Not ordinary curtains. Thick, heavy, theatrical curtains that wouldn't look out of place on the stage of a minor opera house. These draperies, often made of brocade velvet or the mysterious fabric known as morning damask, were designed to block not just the light of the moon, but the mere idea of it. A proper moon curtain required 2 adults to close one, to hold the rod steady, and a third to whisper encouraging remarks from the hallway. Some curtains were so heavy that they required their own support beams. One aristocrat in Surrey reportedly had his windows boarded over, entirely stating, "If I cannot see the moon, it cannot see me." Checkmate. There were accessories too: eye masks embroidered with stars to ward off envy, moon-neutralizing window crystals. One small society in Norwich promoted the hanging of silver teaspoons above the bed to reflect lunar influence into harmless whimsy. Still the moon persisted. It glared in through keyholes. It shimmered on wash basins. It made wallpaper look like it was breathing. And once it was noticed, you could not unnotice it. It was there, the ultimate nocturnal supervisor. Many believed the moon stirred up the subconscious, drawing out memories and mischief. One diary entry from 1885 reads, "Dreamed again of cabbage and regret. Moon was full. Suspicious." Another claimed his dreams were louder during moonlight, filled with doorbells and unsent letters. The goat, if you're curious, was reportedly unaffected, but did insist on sleeping facing west. Historians still argue over whether lunar light genuinely disrupted sleep, or whether the belief simply gave shape to already restless nights. It's worth noting that Victorian bedrooms were rarely light-proof. The firelight flickered, the street lamps buzzed, the wallpaper glowed faintly with arsenic-based paint. So perhaps the moon was just another glow in a room already half awake. Still, the fear endured. There were reports, some scientific, others pure folklore, that moonlight could bleach the skin, curl the hair, and cause fits of poetry. One nervous young man refused to go to bed during full moons unless his sister stood guard with a parasol and a handbell. Another claimed to sleep under a wooden plank balanced on 4 soup cans. "It blocks the rays," he explained. "Also makes me dream of lumber yards." And then came the moon fasting movement. This group, equal parts mystic and melodramatic, believed that one should eat lightly, speak less, and avoid mirrors during the full moon phase. Their sleep routines involved silent brushing of the teeth, placing a white feather under the pillow, and making sure one's bed faced exactly north-northeast. They had a newsletter. It was mostly recipes for boiled celery. Of course, not everyone resisted. A smaller faction. The Lunars embraced the moon, believing it offered prophetic dreams and nightly wisdom. They slept with the curtains wide open, windows cracked, and often with a small bowl of milk, left out for energies. Most of them slept terribly, but claimed their spiritual alignment was immaculate. In the end, moonlight became yet another participant in the great Victorian drama of sleeplessness. It crept into poems, into paintings, into the language of fatigue. "He's got the moon about him," they'd whisper of someone seen staring out the window at 2:00 a.m. "She's been touched by silver," they'd say, of a woman whose nightgown fluttered just a bit too gracefully in the wind. And really, who among them hadn't been? Because the moon, like so much else in those candlelit bedrooms, was less about science and more about symbol, a presence, a pressure, a reminder that the world was still turning even as your thoughts refused to settle. And so the curtains were drawn, the spoons hung, the dreams softened into moonlit half-scenes that began somewhere near a garden gate and ended with a chair that couldn't stop sighing. Sleep didn't always come, but when it did, it slipped in sideways, quietly, while the moon wasn't looking. Now, should the moon be too bold, the cat too involved, and your pillow still holding a grudge, you might be tempted to turn once again to nature's cupboard, and there, sitting politely behind the chamomile underneath the valerian root, and next to the long-forgotten jar labeled rabbit essence, possibly you would find bark tea, specifically willow bark tea, though frankly any tree would do in a pinch. You see, the Victorians, ever eager to convert plant matter into beverage form, believed deeply in the healing powers of tree bark. The inner lining, when steeped, strained, and braced for, was said to relieve headaches, calm fevers, and most importantly, seduce the body into sleep, with the gentle charm of a woodland librarian. The taste unholy. Even the most devout tea drinkers described it as wet disappointment, like licking a soggy fence or the flavor of regretful mulch. And yet, it was endured, sipped in drawing rooms, quaffed beside bedpans, and occasionally hidden behind larger, more enthusiastic gulps of brandy. The most popular variation was a brew of white willow bark boiled for 20 minutes until it developed the color of weak shoe polish and the aroma of recently mopped barn floors, mixed with a touch of lemon to soften the shame it was swallowed just before bed with the solemnity of a funeral vow. Did it work? Historians still argue. Modern science suggests willow bark does contain salicin, a cousin to aspirin, and may indeed offer mild relief to the aching and overly alert. But the Victorians rarely stopped at science. They added folklore, ritual, and the occasional decorative leaf pressed dramatically into the rim of the teacup. Some even claimed that if you drank it under the gaze of a family portrait, you'd dream of your ancestors offering approving nods from the beyond. Others just had nightmares about being chased through forests by judgmental trees. There were, of course, alternatives. Elm bark for the daring, oak bark for the overconfident. One booklet titled Night Brews from the British Tree offered a recipe that included diuil, 1 teaspoon dried willow bark, 3 drops elderberry tincture, 1 thimble of brandy, and a single whispered apology to the tree. It doesn't count unless you mean it, the footnote warned. Some people insisted on foraging their own bark, which led to several regrettable evenings in the countryside, and one infamous incident involving a very cross squirrel. The squirrel, it should be noted later, took up residence in the goat's feed trough and refused to leave until bribed with rhubarb. Others, wishing to avoid the effort-bought pre-packaged sachets labeled with dreamy names like drowsy dendron, sleepy sapling, or the silent branch. Most of these were bark shavings mixed with old chamomile and mystery stems, but the packaging was lovely, and sleep, as we know, is 30% placebo and 70% increasingly poor decisions. And still, the insomniacs drank. They drank because they were tired, because the clocks ticked too loudly, because the cat had started sleeping directly on their sternum and humming, because the moon was back again staring in through the window like an unpaid tax collector. They drank because at a certain hour even a cup of twig water felt like a plan. Did it help sometimes? Or at least it gave the illusion of movement. The gentle clatter of the spoon, the slow swirling of steam, the warmth in the belly. It felt like doing something, and for the sleepless, that's often half the battle. There were even tea ceremonies of sorts, soft rituals carried out alone or in pairs. A small tray, a favorite mug, a sigh, a silence. A final glance at the fire before blowing out the lamp. Some households assigned bark tea duties to the eldest child, believing it would build character and patience. Most of those children grew up with a lifelong distrust of woodland walks and the smell of wet bark. A few particularly earnest individuals composed poems about their teas, such as this unfortunate stanza preserved in the diary of Miss Cordelia Bramble. O gentle cup of withered tree, infuse thy strength and steady me. Though taste be foul and leaf be dry, let not my lids betray the sky. It was not published, and yet for all its bitterness, bark tea had its moment. It joined the quiet chorus of lettuce, water onion socks, and whisper-sung lullabies as part of the great Victorian effort to do something about the dark. Because to brew bark tea was to believe that somewhere within the scraped and boiled edges of a tree's inside layer there might be peace, or at least enough of a distraction to keep you from worrying about the sound the chimney just made. Even the goat reportedly once drank from a spilled cup of willow brew and slept so deeply he missed his usual 3:42 a.m. performance. The entire village slept better that night. And now, dear listener, having sipped your tree water, fluffed your serenaded pillows, and hidden your gaze from the judgmental moon, you may find yourself ready at long last for something bold, something modern, something with a dash of mystery and a good deal of staring. Yes, it's time to meet the Victorian hypnotist. The practice of mesmerism, what we now broadly call hypnosis, began with much hand-waving and very little blinking. Quite literally, practitioners claimed to unlock the mind's natural rhythms, soothe the nervous system, and lull restless souls into an artificial sleep. Whether it worked or not depended largely on your expectations, your susceptibility, and whether or not you minded a stranger hovering above you in a velvet coat, murmuring things like, "Your eyelids grow heavy, and also you owe me 3 shillings. Hypnotism arrived in Victorian England under a cloud of theatricality and pseudoscience. Some hailed it as a miracle cure for sleeplessness. Others feared it would open one's mind to foreign ideas or worse, impolite ones. A few simply wanted to be able to stop thinking about ham at 2:00 a.m. and were willing to risk being stared at to do it. At first, only doctors practiced it. Men with long beards and stern eyes who'd trained in Europe and referred to their patients as subjects. But soon enough, the freelance mesmerists appeared traveling sleep whisperers who set up shop in rented parlors, offered appointments by candlelight, and sometimes wore gloves just for the drama of it. They had many names: the Sleepwright, the Dreamsmith, Madame Selenia, Keeper of Rest. She was later found to be a grocer's wife from Derby, but no one held it against her. They promised everything from deeper dreams to the exorcism of mental clutter. One claimed to specialize in removing thought ruts, which he described as those little loops your mind drives around when you're just trying to sleep and suddenly remember a thing you said in 1843. The sessions were theatrical. The room would be dim. A clock would be muffled. A chair always slightly too large would creak politely as you sank into it. Then the hypnotist would begin murmuring phrases, making slow, deliberate gestures, and occasionally pointing at your forehead as if accusing it of wrongdoing. Sleep is a river, they might say. Let your mind float downstream, past the goat, past the snoring parlor rug, past the unpaid chimney bill. Some swore it worked. Said they felt their limbs go heavy, their breath deepen their thoughts, drift like steam off a cooling teacup. Others said they felt awkward, blinked too much, and worried the mesmerist might ask them to reveal childhood secrets or recite poetry aloud. Historians still argue whether hypnosis ever truly helped with sleep or merely served as a structured space in which one was allowed to rest. After all, being told to close your eyes and relax by a man in velvet with a pocket watch might seem strange, but it beat counting chimney sweeps and avoiding eye contact with your own reflection. Of course, not all hypnotists were equal. Some were kind, soft-spoken guides. Others were charlatans. One infamous fellow known as Dr. Zed claimed to hypnotize entire rooms at once, including the furniture. A skeptical reporter once attended his show and promptly fell asleep, not from hypnosis, but sheer boredom. Dr. Zed considered it a success. There were hypnosis aids, too. Pamphlets like Talk Yourself to Sleep Without Arguing Back and The Inner Lullaby, a guided dialogue between you and your feet. One best-selling guide advised readers to find a candle flame and gaze into it until your thoughts feel politely dismissed. It also warned not to try this near wallpaper that featured faces, as they may interrupt. Some households even had a designated family hypnotist, usually an eccentric uncle or a spinster aunt with unusually steady hands. These amateur practitioners would be called upon at bedtime to murmur comforting nonsense and occasionally perform eyebrow acrobatics until the listener either drifted off or laughed themselves into exhaustion. The goat, when hypnotized, merely blinked and chewed sideways, giving the impression of being deeply unimpressed or possibly already asleep. And then there were the group sessions. These were held in hired parlors and back rooms of tea shops, where clusters of insomniacs gathered to be lulled en masse by a confident man with a waistcoat and an index finger raised dramatically. The participants would recline on mismatched chairs, stare at ceiling cracks, and try not to snore prematurely. Some found it absurd, others oddly soothing. One woman claimed she had her first dream in 6 years during a group session. When asked what it was about, she replied, "It was just a spoon, floating, very kind." Eventually, as with most trends, the hypnotism craze faded. Medicine caught up, beds improved. People grew tired of paying to be told what they already knew, that sleep requires stillness permission, and sometimes someone to tell you that your eyebrows are relaxing now. But for a brief moment, hypnosis offered something rare, a performance of peace, a structured candlelit attempt to do nothing with support And in a world that demanded so much cleanliness, virtue correctly starched collars, being given permission to simply let go was perhaps the most effective lullaby of all. Whether it came from a mesmerist, a friend, or your own whispered inner voice, the message remained the same. You're allowed to rest now. Now, having been stared at by a hypnotist, infused with bark and mildly judged by a cat, the more daring Victorians turned their attention to the architecture of rest itself. That is to say, the bed, or more accurately, all the strange and hopeful ways they tried to improve it through height swing, curtain rope, and in one memorable case by hanging it from the ceiling like an overly confident fruit basket. Let us speak then of hammocks and hanging beds. To be clear, these weren't the breezy garden slings you might associate with tropical holidays and books you never quite finish. No Victorian hanging beds were serious, ambitious affairs, rope-secured, ceiling-mounted, and occasionally mistaken for religious altars by the less informed guest. The trend began, it seems, with a particularly restless naval officer who, upon retiring to land, declared that the ground made him nervous and that he could only sleep while gently at war with gravity. He commissioned a full-sized swinging bed that took 3 carpenters and a nervous goat to install. It worked briefly, then it swung too hard during a thunderstorm and launched him gently through the wardrobe. Nevertheless, the idea caught on. Victorians adored novelty, especially if it involved sleep ropes or the appearance of being gently cradled by the void. Manuals began circulating, suspended repose, a guide to the floating nap to sleep, perchance to sway, and rope-based slumber and you. These hanging beds were built in several configurations, ceiling suspended with iron hooks and the sound of mild creaking for ambience, wall-mounted swing beds ideal for narrow rooms and people with trusting relationships to plaster, and the occasional tree bed hybrid popular in countryside homes, which sometimes doubled as bird sanctuaries unintentionally. For the middle-class hammocks offered a more accessible version of the dream, sold in catalogs under names like the Repose Ribbon or Cradle of the Windless Mind. These indoor hammocks promised peaceful rocking and gentle spinal realignment. Most delivered mild nausea and the sound of one's spouse shouting, "You've flipped again." Historians still argue whether hammocks helped or hindered Victorian sleep. Some suggest that the gentle sway mimicked the rocking motion of infancy. Others argue that it reminded people of boats and therefore seasickness and therefore regret. Still others point out that the average Victorian bedroom wasn't particularly hammock-friendly unless you had a fondness for swinging into bookcases. And then there was the problem of getting in. Proper hammock entry was a matter of timing, flexibility, and divine favor. One step too forceful, and the whole contraption tipped like a judgmental seesaw. Many a nightshirt-clad gentleman was found sprawled beside his swaying bed, muttering about untrustworthy textiles and treacherous knots. There was a brief moment when hammock duets were attempted beds, built for 2 suspended together like matrimonial slings. These experiments often ended in entanglement, philosophical disagreements, or someone waking up with a knee in their ear. One particularly tragic tale comes from a couple in Kent who commissioned a custom double hammock dubbed the marital cocoon. It lasted exactly 1 night before one partner sneezed, and the entire structure spun for 8 consecutive minutes, resulting in a ruined bookshelf and the loss of a prized jam tart. Still, the appeal persisted. There was something deeply attractive about the notion of floating above the worries of the day, a bed that swayed not from restlessness but from design, to be suspended, to be held, to be lifted even slightly from the weight of the floor and the weight of one's own mind. The goat notably refused to enter any room containing a hammock. Whether from distrust or trauma remains unclear. Of course, not all floating beds were literal. Some took the idea more metaphorically. Raised platforms, beds with elaborate drapery that billowed like sails, canopies so tall they had their own microclimates, all meant to suggest elevation separation, the drifting away quality of real sleep. One eccentric gentleman named Lord Lichfield commissioned a rotating bed that slowly turned clockwise throughout the night to align his dreams with the movement of the heavens. It worked beautifully until a housemaid accidentally reversed the gear mechanism, and he woke up convinced time had looped. Others believed elevation changed the temperature of dreams. Beds were placed on risers. Some even slept in attics, not for quiet, but to get closer to the sky. The thin air, they believed, made dreams more ethereal, less earthy, and far less likely to involve tax collectors or badly behaved poultry. In short, the Victorians didn't just lie in bed. They theorized about it. They redesigned it. They made it spin, sway, rise, and recline at angles previously reserved for interrogation chairs and fainting couches. And why? Because deep down they believed that sleep wasn't just about stillness, it was about surrender. And perhaps it was easier to surrender when you felt lifted, carried, cradled in something gently absurd, even if that meant occasionally being launched into the bureau by an enthusiastic draft. Of course, once you've floated, flipped, flung, and possibly concussed yourself on the corner of an antique armoire, you might return begrudgingly to the traditional Victorian bed. And what a beast it was. Let us now explore the labyrinthine landscape of Victorian bed design, a realm where sleeping furniture was not merely functional, but a statement, an obstacle course, and in some cases, a test of one's moral fortitude. The average bed of the 19th century was no simple thing. It was a towering, hulking structure of carved wood, draped fabric, and vaguely disapproving upholstery. 4 posters were the preferred variety. Massive vertical columns, reaching upward like the legs of a very serious table from which hung thick curtains woven of dreams dust and the kind of fabric that whispered, "You don't deserve rest." These curtains were not optional. They served a variety of purposes: warmth, privacy, and according to some, shielding one's soul from nocturnal drafts. One pamphlet from 1846 titled "Night Miasmas," an intimate threat, warned that uncurtained beds left the sleeper vulnerable to moral seepage and errant nocturnal thought vapors. Exactly what these were was never clarified, but everyone agreed they sounded dreadfully inconvenient. The bed itself was constructed of a wooden frame, upon which lay a rope lattice tightened regularly using a wooden tool known rather satisfyingly as a bed key. The origin of the phrase "sleep tight" comes from this exact practice, not from tucking as many believe, but from ensuring that the ropes beneath your mattress did not sag like a defeated sponge. Over this rope grid was the mattress, often a cotton-stuffed sack, or for the less fortunate, a bag of straw, with dreams of being cotton. These mattresses were lumpy, temperamental, and occasionally held small surprises like goose feathers, misplaced buttons, or in one reported case, a copy of Psalms for the sleepless, mislaid during a particularly pious nap. Above that came the feather bed. Yes, another layer. Like a duvet someone had given up on halfway through its transformation. It was meant to soften the blow of the rope and sack arrangement below, but often just created a sense of mild vertical disorientation. Several sleepers reported waking up between layers, unsure which side gravity had chosen, and then came the bolsters, large, firm, and rarely where you left them. These cylindrical tyrants of Victorian bedding were placed either at the head or beneath the knees, depending on your condition class or the phase of the moon. No one truly knew what they did, but removing one was rumored to bring about dreams of scandal. Pillows came next, stacked in ceremonial fashion. 2 for the head, 1 for display, and 1 emergency pillow, in case a guest appeared unannounced and required immediate reclining. Pillowcases were lace-trimmed, monogrammed, and held to impossibly high starch standards. Floppy pillows were considered evidence of a disordered household or moral laziness. Blankets and coverlets followed, often layered like an archaeological dig of one's anxieties. Heavy wool in winter, light muslin in summer, a quilt from grandmother hand-stitched with either love or unresolved family tension. And at the very top, the bedspread, which must never be disturbed lest the household cat or houseguest judge you unworthy. Getting into bed was not a simple crawl and collapse maneuver. It was a process. First, you'd perform the bed-turning ritual, peeling back layers without disturbing the structural integrity of the arrangement. Then you'd climb in, often with a small footstool, and adjust yourself within the confines of rope mattress and morality. Finally, the curtains were drawn shut, leaving you in a soft, muffled womb of woven judgment. Did it work? Did these beds actually help people sleep? Historians still argue. Some point to the comfort provided by weight and enclosure, what modern psychology might call a cocooning effect. Others argue that the sheer complexity of Victorian beds discouraged sleep entirely, as one spent most of the night adjusting blankets, chasing bolsters, or wondering whether one's toes had gone numb from wool compression or divine punishment. One 1873 sleep diary entry reads, 11:04 in bed, 11:20 found myself atop quilt below bedspread, 11:43 reoriented pillow, 12:07 dreams of linen closets and social failure. There were, of course, innovations. Some beds came with warming pans, metal dishes filled with coals slid between the sheets before bed. These could either deliver a gentle heat or set the mattress alight, depending on who was operating them. One unfortunate uncle named Horace once singed the entire left side of the guest bed, resulting in a permanent patch, known henceforth as the crispy corner. Others experimented with adjustable beds, operated by crank lever or bellows. These allowed one to raise or lower parts of the body based on preference or medical condition. The devices made alarming noises in the night, and once trapped a gentleman at a 45-degree angle for several hours until rescued by a particularly sarcastic chambermaid. And then, of course, there was the infamous case of Sir Whifflestrop's slumber cloak, a wearable bed made of quilted panels designed to be worn upright so one could sleep wherever the soul demands. He debuted it at a garden party, tripped into a pond, and was last seen drifting toward the duck house like a defeated chrysalis. Still, for all its pomp and padding, the Victorian bed held a kind of sleepy majesty. It was not merely a piece of furniture. It was a stage, a fortress, a declaration. Here lies a person who has done their best, paid their taxes, and is now prepared to engage in 8 hours of complicated, swaddled, horizontal activity. And perhaps that's what made it comforting in the end. Because when you're held by ropes wrapped in layers, guarded by bolsters, and shrouded by curtains thick enough to stop time itself, it's hard not to feel even briefly like sleep might take you seriously. Now, just when you thought it couldn't get any more elaborate than sleeping inside a draped wooden box lined with boiling coals and judgment, along came Sir Whifflestrop. His full name, brace yourself, was Sir Percival St. Horatio Whifflestrop, 7th Earl of Crumblehay, and unofficial champion of the longest nap. During a parliamentary address, 42 minutes, record unbroken. And he was, for lack of a gentler phrase, obsessed with optimizing sleep. Not better sleep, not longer sleep. No. What Sir Whifflestrop pursued was convenient sleep, the kind that allowed a man to doze off mid-errand, mid-sentence, even mid-equestrian trot, if the horse had strong knees. His solution? A wearable bed. Yes, a slumber cloak. It was, according to the surviving sketches and a few unfortunate eyewitnesses, a sort of quilted overcoat, half dressing gown, half duffel bag lined with soft padding, hidden pouches for warmers, and a detachable hood that doubled as a pillow. The hem contained a collapsible foot hammock. The sleeves had extendable mittens. One model even included a pouch for a bedtime biscuit sealed with a velvet ribbon. Sir Whifflestrop's first public unveiling occurred at a country house weekend. The plan was simple: arrive at the breakfast table already half asleep, sit quietly, with the air of a man recently cuddled by the divine, and dramatically recline at the precise moment the toast was buttered. Instead, he tripped over a footstool, fell into the haddock tray, and muttered something about being at one with repose before knocking over a floral arrangement and vanishing beneath the table. Still, the idea had merit. Victorians adored multi-purpose garments, particularly if they involved buttons, brocade, or theatrical names. The slumber cloak was soon joined by the dozing mantle lined with goose down and shaped like a bishop's cope, the nap cravat, which could be unwrapped into a full neck pillow if the carriage ride grew long, and the repose corset, which absolutely no one wore twice. Historians still argue whether these garments were fashion statements or cries for help. One surviving letter from a friend of Whifflestrop reads, "Percy arrived dressed like a collapsing armchair. We said nothing. He appeared so hopeful." But Whifflestrop wasn't done. Emboldened by failure, or perhaps simply unaware of it, he sought to patent the cloak under the title, "A Garment," for the purpose of sustaining sleep in varied environments. Domestic and otherwise, the patent office responded with, "Please clarify whether this is meant for humans or some species of bat." Undeterred, he pressed on. He funded the creation of 12 prototypes each, with modifications based on early user feedback. These included a version with built-in ear flaps and lavender sachets, popular with grandmothers, a waterproof model for garden naps, less popular after the slug incident, and a social edition with armholes so one could shake hands while technically still asleep, deeply unsettling. The climax of his campaign came with a public demonstration in Hyde Park, where Sir Whifflestrop stood atop a small platform, gave a brief speech on the philosophy of portable slumber, and attempted to gracefully recline into a pondside nap. Unfortunately, a sudden gust of wind caught the billowing fabric, spun him twice, and deposited him directly into a family of startled ducks. Witnesses described the scene as mossy, startlingly quilted, and not without pathos. The goat, present by chance, was observed chewing thoughtfully on a detached mitten. The cloak, drenched and slightly torn, was retrieved. The ducks, ever forgiving, returned to their nap. Sir Whifflestrop did not pursue a second demonstration, and yet the cloak endured, sort of. One or two eccentric thinkers gave it a try. A school teacher in York, wore his 2 staff meetings and claimed it reduced workplace conflict. A baker in Devon used one during his lunch breaks and said he dreamed only of custard. A librarian wore hers while shelving books and accidentally napped for 3 days in the poetry section. It became, in certain circles, a symbol of noble laziness, a statement that sleep was not something to be postponed, hoarded, or earned, but something to be invited at any hour with dignity and flair. Whifflestrop's legacy is preserved not in law but in lore. His cloak, cleaned and folded, now rests in a small museum alcove near Wapping, next to a handwritten card that reads, "Sleep wherever the heart desires, but mind the pond." Because absurd as it may have seemed, Sir Whifflestrop touched on something universal, the dream of sleeping well without needing to go anywhere, do anything, or deserve it first. To wear sleep, to become rest, to nap as you are, and perhaps on quiet nights, when the wind is soft and the curtains sway gently. Some part of the soul remembers him wrapped in, stitching adrift in dreams, snoring softly beneath the stars, while the ducks float by. Now let us venture into quieter territory, where the innovations faded, the cloaks were hung, the cats repositioned themselves squarely atop one's chest, and the Victorian sleeper turned inward to something far more delicate, more revealing, and occasionally more embarrassing than any feather-stuffed mattress or moon-resistant curtain. We're speaking, of course, of the dream diary, not merely a notebook, not merely a hobby. For many Victorians, it was a sacred object, half confessional, half laboratory, where the night's peculiar dramas were preserved like butterflies, flattened between pages, pressed in ink, and labeled with the utmost care. Dream diaries became especially popular in the latter half of the 19th century, when psychology was just beginning to peek its timid head above the covers and whisper things like, "Maybe your dreams aren't just about last night's pie." Some Victorians were meticulous. They kept their dream books on the nightstand, along with a candle stub, a stubby pencil, and occasionally a biscuit for strength. At the first hint of dawn, or earlier, if the goat bleated, they'd jot down their dreams in looping script, recording everything from flying fish to uninvited in-laws arriving in the form of armchairs. One gentleman's preserved diary reads, "Dreamed I was being chased by a tax collector made entirely of sponge cake. Escaped via Zeppelin. Feel this may be related to my feelings about Aunt Millie." Others were more symbolic in their entries. They drew pictures, sketches of staircases to nowhere, eyes that wept steam, a recurring goat that may or may not have represented their father. Freud hadn't arrived in full yet, but the Victorians already suspected that the subconscious was up to something naughty. But it wasn't all metaphor and moon logic. Dream diaries had practical applications too. One pamphlet, Somnia, a guide to recording and interpreting the mind's nightly frolics, advised readers to use dream patterns to predict digestion, the weather, and marital fidelity. It was wildly incorrect on all 3 fronts, but the handwriting was excellent. Some families even made dream journaling a group activity. Morning tea would be accompanied by recitations of the night's visions from the mystical to the mundane. A particularly poetic child might describe floating across a field of lace umbrellas. A disgruntled uncle might mutter, "Dreamt I was in church again." Hymns. Terrible. Over time, however, a strange thing began to happen. The dreams, once charmingly nonsensical, began to reflect secrets. Real ones. Things left unsaid during the day found their way into the pages. Regrets, longings, guilts, and the occasional resentment about a sister's superior jam recipe. One woman who only signed her entries as M wrote the same dream every Thursday for 6 months. He knocked at the door wearing no shoes, said nothing. The rain stopped. Then I woke. To this day, historians argue who he was. Some say a lost lover. Some say a forgotten milkman. Some say it doesn't matter. What matters is that she wrote it, that she needed to write it. Dream diaries became repositories of the unspoken. Locked drawers held volumes of them, tied in ribbon, labeled in code, often disguised as recipe books or hymnal transcriptions. Many were only discovered after death, tucked beneath floorboards or wedged behind headboards, filled with tales of flying, of weeping, of kissing someone you were never supposed to see again. There were even professional dream readers. Yes, you could pay someone, a well-dressed woman with peacock feathers in her hat, or a man with an unsettling beard, to interpret your dreams for you. They'd examine your entries with the solemnity of a priest, then tell you what it all meant. Usually repressed feelings, possibly indigestion, definitely unresolved something. But not all interpretations were so tidy. One particularly famous case involved a merchant who dreamed every night of chickens reciting Latin. Over the course of a year, his dream diary filled with poultry sermons and feathered philosophy. When read aloud to a local dream analyst, she wept, declared it the soul's protest against commerce, and married him 3 weeks later. Not every dream diary ended in romance. Some ended in embarrassment. One poor man's entries were accidentally mailed to his vicar, resulting in a sermon titled, "We must not be led by our night furniture." He never dreamed of pillows again. But the most curious thing about dream diaries is what they revealed about sleep itself. Because no matter the content, whether it was floating goats or marching cutlery, each entry was proof that the sleeper had passed into the other world, if only briefly. That despite the ticking clocks, the failing tonics, the too firm mattress sleep had happened. Even if it was odd, even if it was fleeting, even if the goat interrupted it halfway through. And perhaps that was why people wrote them. Not just to understand their dreams, but to prove they'd been there, that they'd crossed the border, that they'd visited the strange kingdom behind the eyelids and returned with tales to tell. So they wrote, night after night, with ink-stained fingers and flickering candles, with crossed-out lines and barely legible panic, with poetry and nonsense and confessions no one would ever read. Because in the end, even if the dream was absurd, even if it involved arguing with a walrus over biscuit etiquette, it was theirs, and it meant they had slept. And now, dear listener, we arrive at the final chapter of this long, softly absurd parade of efforts, potions, leaf wrappings, goat-related mishaps, and well-meaning rituals. For after all the noise and all the silence, after every onion hammock and whispered lullaby to a moderately interested pillow, the Victorians, at least some of them, did what all truly weary people eventually do. They gave up. They stopped trying to outsmart the night. They stopped stirring lettuce water by candlelight, stopped listening for the sea in their teacups, stopped threatening the moon with curtains and teaspoons, and instead they turned once more toward the one thing they had feared from the very beginning: stillness, that terrifying, unstructured, undecorated quiet. It happened slowly, of course. The grand cures faded with the passing of fads. The dream clubs dwindled as their most verbose members finally nodded off mid-sentence. The goat, now older and less theatrical, preferred to nap beside the hearth, with one eye half closed and his ambitions considerably reduced. In time, a kind of soft surrender took hold. Gone were the elaborate sleep ensembles, meek and wearable feather nests. Gone were the hired mesmerists and the bath water that smelled suspiciously of gravy. Gone was the need to explain to the neighbors why your pillow had its own musical preferences. Instead, people returned to what they'd once found too bare: a quiet room, a not too lumpy bed, and nothing at all but breath, darkness, and the slow exhale of night. It was unnerving at first, the absence of rituals, the blankness of it. Many feared that without their sleep tricks and nightly brews, the dreams would dry up and the restlessness would return. And yet, the opposite happened. For some it took a week, for others a season. But little by little, without the burden of expectation, without the performance of bedtime, sleep began to arrive again. Not in dramatic waves, not like a choir of dreams, just quietly, softly, unannounced. Historians still argue over what caused this shift. Was it societal fatigue, a natural correction, or just the final realization that trying too hard to sleep is like trying to fall in love during a job interview, technically possible but wildly unhelpful under pressure? In their final letters, many former sleep seekers describe it as a kind of release, a decision not to battle the night but to join it, to lie in the dark not as a failure but as a participant, to treat wakefulness not as an enemy but a companion who might eventually tire of your company and tiptoe out without saying goodbye. And so the rooms grew simpler. The teacups were returned to the cupboard. The goat snored beside the kitchen door. The clocks, still ticking, were no longer scolded for it. They simply were, as were the curtains and the dreams and the deeply ordinary sheets, with no secrets stitched into their hems. Sleep returned, not as a reward, but as a side effect. A humble gift offered to those who had finally stopped chasing it with butterfly nets and buckets of bark, and those once frenzied souls who had brewed and measured and hummed into their bolsters learned instead to listen, to be still, to wait, and in that waiting to rest. Now, as we close this long and winding candlelit tale, let us leave behind the remedies and rituals, the eccentric earls and serenaded pillows. Let us step softly through the quiet corridors of the past, where the fire burns low and the chairs creak only when asked. The room around you is still. The night is no longer something to conquer, but something to inhabit slowly, gently, without urgency. The air is cool, the blankets warm, and in some distant corner of your mind, the goat finally settles down. The old wooden floors no longer creak with mischief. The clocks have stopped ticking quite so loudly. The pages of that dream diary are blank, ready waiting, but not demanding anything of you. Outside, perhaps the moon continues her soft vigil, neither friend nor foe. Just there, pale and polite. No need to measure time now, no need to count sheep or rebuke the pillows. There are no steps left, no tonics, no tips, just the soft hush of your own breath, steady and unbothered. Maybe you dream, maybe you don't. Maybe tonight, like the Victorians in their final surrender, you simply rest in the knowledge that sleep does not need to be earned. It only needs to be allowed. Everything's quiet now. You're safe. Let the rest take you.